Okay. Just a few housekeeping things. Welcome. This is Recovery in Midlife, a conversation with Betsy Brenner and Kate Arvesen. So, all right. Welcome, everybody. My name is Kristen Portland. I am the Executive Director of ANID. We're the National Association of Anorexia Nervosa and Associated Disorders. We have support for lots of different people. If you haven't heard of us yet, please check us out at anid.org. We have a helpline, virtual support groups, mentorship, an online referral service if you want to get connected to some help but don't want to pick up the phone. And we have ANID approach guides where you can learn more and even more educational resources. So I am very, very excited to be joined today by two incredibly fantastic people. The first, Betsy Brenner. Betsy is an author, recovery speaker, and peer support mentor with ANID, by the way. In her 2021 memoir, The Longest Match, Rallying to Defeat an Eating Disorder in Midlife, Betsy details her life, one filled with blessings and privilege, but also with emotional trauma, profound grief, anxiety, depression, and ultimately a diagnosis of anorexia in midlife. Her eating disorder became the catalyst for healing. So we're here today to discuss her book, her journey, along with Kate. So Kate is born and raised in Dallas, a registered dietitian specializing in eating disorders, and is a dietitian at Eating Recovery Center, our partner for this webinar today. So you're going to hear more about what they have to offer. So Kate earned a bachelor's degree in nutrition science at Baylor University, went on to complete her internship and master's in clinical nutrition at the University of Texas, Southwestern Medical Center. She's committed to providing the highest level of care to her patients and views eating disorders as her calling in life to help people return to a balanced, healthy lifestyle. So we're gonna get started in just a few moments. First, a couple little housekeeping things here. Feel free to ask questions. Drop them in the chat along the way. I'll be moderating that. I'll bring them up so Kate and Betsy can answer as we're talking. We're mostly here to listen to them talk. I'll be throwing out some questions, but I would love to put yours out as well. So feel free to use the raise hand feature or just drop it in the chat and I will be able to keep an eye on that. So guys, welcome. I am so happy to see you here today.
Thanks. It's wonderful to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for putting this all together.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk with you guys. I've gotten to know both of you just a little bit in the course of getting this set up and with practicing. So I really can't thank you enough to be here. So let's get things started. So Betsy, what inspired you to write this amazing memoir, The Longest Match?
That's a great question that I get asked all the time. And surprisingly, I never planned to be an author. I never planned to write a book. I'd written my recovery story and I'd been told by a few people that my life story had the makings of a book. My memoir is truly a silver lining of the pandemic. When everything that I was involved in was shut down, I began writing chapter by chapter. I worked with a professional editor who helped me map out my life and put the chapters in order. But I wrote the entire manuscript from March of 2020 when everything shut down and completed my manuscript in January of 2021. And my book was published a year ago in May 2021. I can honestly say, but for the pandemic, I would probably still be on chapter 1 or 2. So it literally gave me the gift of time.
That's amazing. So Betsy, what really jumped out to me about your book is that yours, while there are a lot of recovery memoirs out there, yours is the first one I've read that was written by someone who was recovering, not as a young person, someone in college, someone in high school. So Kate, how many women Betsy's age or older are dealing with eating disorders?
Yeah, so the percentage that research is saying right now is that around 13% of women over 50 are experiencing signs of eating disorder symptoms. And so at ERC, we do see patients in their midlife, see patients at all ages, but the ones I worked with in midlife have been just a joy getting to know. And I've loved working with them and hearing their stories of, their life and where they're at now and how to get them into recovery. And so I'm really thankful that Eating Recovery Center, we're always getting new research and training on how to help people at different stages of life.
Mhm.
I will say I hear from readers all the time who feel that they're the only one at their age that is struggling with an eating disorder. So one thing my book has done, those who have read it, who are my age or older, a little bit younger, they feel like they're not alone, that there's somebody out there who has recovered in midlife, and it can just give them hope when they're feeling so isolated and alone. And so people all over are struggling by themselves, and just that connection and opportunities like this to talk about eating disorders in midlife and let people know they're not alone and that help is out there, like at ERC and other places.
Betsy, yeah, thank you so much for writing your book and talking today. When I saw that you were doing this webinar, I wanted to jump on and do it, mainly because the patients I've worked with have felt the way you're describing. And so now having a resource to provide them, like, hey, they're not alone, like there are other people their age struggling, is huge in recovery, because recovery is all about support. And just like you're saying, having someone else share your story can really provide that hope. So thank you so much for providing resources for people in their midlives.
Mhm.
Thank you.
And your book was really only the start of it. You've done so much since then.
Mm-hmm.
But we actually had someone type in, an ERC alum just was wondering if you happen to know any stats for men in their 40s. And if we don't know, maybe that's something we could look up and send out afterwards as well. I know there's a lot of specificity there, so.
So I don't know specifically for men in their 40s. I do know that in Denver, ERC has a whole unit now just for research, which is awesome. So that's something I could ask Dr. Amelia if they have research on that.
Okay.
And I think just like women in midlife, men at any age, and also adults like in their 40s, it's one of those groups that is not as focused on as frequently as some of the more common groups that we see struggling with eating disorders.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like the people are more aware of eating disorders in early 20s or in teenage years, but there is a lack of awareness in that midlife stage.
Yeah. So stereotypically, eating disorders really are associated with younger women. So why is it that people in midlife need a different approach than that population?
So people in their midlife need a different approach. They're in a different season. They have a lot to unpack through the different chapters of their life to get to the root of what's going on. And they also are going through different things, aging processes, body changing, menopause, natural weight gain. They're at higher risk for osteoporosis, delayed wound healing, brain fog, hormone imbalance, cardiovascular risk. And that's a #1 killer in women, like heart attacks are. And with anorexia nervosa, we know it depletes the walls of the heart, which puts people at that high risk. Patients that might have binge eating disorder, they're at higher risk for hypertension, type 2 diabetes, as well as cardiovascular disease.
Wow. So Betsy, I wonder, what was your experience like getting treatment?
Well, the first thing is when you're struggling with an eating disorder, you really don't necessarily realize you are at first. For me, it was a physician who noticed the weight loss, not my primary care physician, but another physician that I see was concerned because I had lost weight, and she contacted my primary care physician, who then wanted me to make an appointment with the dietitian. And it was at my first appointment with my dietitian that I was diagnosed with anorexia. Now, I, like most people, had preconceived notions. How could I have anorexia? I'm in my 40s. I had the same preconceived notions that many do, that eating disorders, especially anorexia, only impact young adolescents and young adults. So I had a lot to learn about eating disorders. Like many, I was in denial at first. I don't have anorexia, I'm fine. But I had to really invest myself emotionally and physically into the process. And I think I hear from so many people who are struggling at older ages, and I think there's that much more shame and secrecy and hesitancy to seek professional treatment. My treatment was all outpatient with a dietitian and a therapist who specialized in eating disorders. I know it was recommended that I try residential treatment. I was medically stable, but it would have been very beneficial, but I wasn't willing to disrupt my family life. And so many of us in midlife are caregivers, whether it's children or aging parents or spouses, partners, whoever it is. It's very hard to put your own recovery up there at the top of the priority list. So my treatment started with that first appointment with my dietitian and the diagnosis of anorexia, but I was shocked by the diagnosis.
We got a pretty relevant question in the chat. So someone would like to know, do people struggling with an eating disorder later in life always have a history of eating disorders, or are there people who develop an eating disorder for the first time at a later stage?
I can answer that first non-clinically. I mean, I think I'm unusual in that I was not diagnosed till I was in my 40s. The groups I see in my age range are many who had an eating disorder and they were younger and perhaps recovered and then relapsed later in life. And there are those who have unfortunately struggled their entire lives. And that's when it's so difficult to even envision what recovery could be like. And then there's those like myself who was diagnosed in my 40s. But even though I was diagnosed in my 40s, in looking back through old journals and diaries in preparation for writing my memoir, the seeds of my eating disorder were certainly planted throughout my childhood and adulthood, even though the diagnosis didn't come till later. But that's not a clinical impression of midlife eating disorders. Kate can speak to that, but those are definitely the different groups I see of women in midlife who are struggling.
Yeah, I think to answer that question, it could be both. People could be struggling with it for a long time, and maybe they never had the access to treatment 20 or 30 years ago like we do today. I know in Dallas specifically, we only had a few centers, and one hospital only had like 10 adult beds, and one hospital only had like 12 kid beds. And our head doctor at ERC, Dr. Setliff, she was the one who went from a main hospital here to start ERC. And ever since then, we've had so many more beds open up and resources in the DFW area. So it's been really cool to see as a Dallas resident. In fourth grade, my best friend had an eating disorder. We saw Dr. Setliff, and there wasn't many resources then, to now, 15, 20 years later, seeing all these resources, which is truly a blessing to so many people. And then also people developing eating disorders later in life, that can happen. So many things happen: moving houses, the loss of parents, again, being the primary caregiver, going through menopause, having natural weight changes, that can also trigger eating disorder behaviors, or trying to be that perfect mom or housewife, whatever that may be. And again, this can also happen to men as well. With eating disorders, we know that it is increasing in males as more awareness is happening across the nation. So it can be both. It can happen later or in midlife.
So Kate, you just mentioned people who are parents. So what effect does that really have on families? Recovery on its own is a huge, huge accomplishment. But Kate, what do you see in the families of people who are recovering in midlife, people who are recovering in front of their children, in front of their partners?
So we help them at ERC rebuild their life and focus on their values and acceptance and really form a new connection. A lot of times the eating disorder wants you to be isolated, separated from people you love. So we work with them on having meals with their family, going to the grocery store, cooking together, doing those things again, and really tasting and seeing that life is good. And it is a process, but at ERC, we're passionate about that family aspect of care. And it's really hard, don't get me wrong, like during that process, because in treatment, they're missing out on their daughter's graduation or their son's prom night or whatever. So helping them recover so that they won't miss future events with their kids.
Yeah.
And Betsy probably has more to say from her perspective and story.
From my perspective, I will say I felt like I was living two parallel lives. And I think that is due to the tremendous amount of shame and secrecy that I think is true with any eating disorder, but especially the older you are, the more expectations are that, why are you still struggling? Or why do you have an eating disorder? I had a friend say to me, like, don't let that happen. So I led very parallel lives, and it wasn't until my recovery was much further along that I intersected the two. One road was the treatment road. I was very good about all my appointments with my dietitian and my therapist. And then the other road was living my life, mother of 3, high school tennis coach, involved in many activities. But I wouldn't let people in, even with my own family, with my own husband. I felt embarrassed to talk about my eating disorder. Certainly he knew everything that was happening. There were certainly no secrets, but I didn't feel comfortable talking about it. And I, at that point, was still trying to find my voice, and I wasn't capable of saying, this is how I need you to support me. And when you're in the throes of it, it's so hard to see beyond the eating disorder. So for many years, I went about my treatment with my outpatient team and lived my life in a parallel way. And it wasn't until my recovery was much stronger that I was able to start letting people in. And now, having become literally an open book, there are no secrets. There is no shame. My story is mine. And I'm sure there's people that have said, people I know, like, wow, I can't believe she wrote about that. But it's so freeing. I mean, recovery has given me my voice and my ability to be vulnerable and authentic and not worry about what other people think. But when I was struggling, I couldn't let anybody in. I was struggling within myself and within the throes of the eating disorder. So I led two very parallel lives. My children didn't really know what was going on. My twins, who are now 20, were in elementary school, so they didn't really have any idea. And my older daughter, who was in high school at the time, she certainly knew I was struggling. We both were struggling with different things, and it manifests itself differently. For me, it was the eating disorder. So, but again, I didn't feel comfortable talking about it.
There's a couple of relevant questions here that I wanna ask. So someone wants to know, how can they help a partner support them through the process? Because so many of the resources out there for family support are aimed at parents supporting children.
Yeah. So at ERC Monday nights, we do family education, and on Tuesday morning. And yes, we do see a lot of parent and kid education. And so I try to be mindful as possible to also include more like husband and wife, or spouse partners relationship too. But like what Betsy was saying, is that openness and vulnerability. I'm so glad Betsy shared that, because I can see the strength in her now of just being open, and that's so cool and such a good testimony for all of us, just letting the light in. And so with a partner, when I've worked with spouses, it's really that openness, eating together, being vulnerable. And the nutrition side of things is being honest about blind weights, being honest about how much movement they're doing, if they're going to a workout class or not, being honest about, going to the grocery store and what they're spending on, and identifying those foods that are eating disorder foods, because that can be really sneaky if someone's buying eating disorder foods, for example, something that has a label on it that's very diet culture focused. The husband or wife or whoever needs to know, okay, this is part of his eating disorder or their eating disorder. So we at ERC make sure that that support is really involved, because we know that's one of the top ways that someone can get over an eating disorder is the support.
Yeah, and Kate, ERC offers caregiver support groups. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Another question that came up, and that I think we touched on when we were talking through, this webinar ahead of time, is what does a parent recovering do for a child who may also be struggling?
Mm-hmm. So I can take that. Oftentimes I'll work with the child and adolescent population, and all of a sudden, like, it kind of triggers strong reactions with parents. And then as a team, we talk to parents about, hey, like, what is that bringing up in your own life and how can help? Because we often say the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And how can we help you get the resources so you can model normalized eating to your child?
Mm-hmm.
And I will say my parents have been gone a very long time, but looking back again, the hindsight I have now from preparing to write my memoir, there are definitely some things my mother said and did that there's no doubt they contributed to development of an eating disorder. And now I remember things like her bragging about how low her weight was on her wedding day and things like that. And saying certain food groups were bad. That sends a really powerful message. And even more importantly, I never learned intuitive eating as a child. Most children, that's something that's just so natural until society has, environment has a chance to change that. But my mom controlled what we ate, when we ate, and how much we ate. And because of her own issues, she struggled with never diagnosed anxiety and OCD. We weren't even allowed into the kitchen to help ourselves to a snack or a drink. Here's breakfast, here's lunch, here's dinner. Even when I was in college, I would come home and she'd pour the milk on my cereal for me. I mean, there was no choice. There was no tuning into hunger cues and deciding what I wanted to eat when and how much. So at the time, I didn't realize the impact it had on me, but it definitely had a negative impact on me and contributed to developing an eating disorder.
We also just had a quick clarifying question. Kate, could you let us know what are eating disorder foods?
So eating disorders oftentimes that's such a good question. It's like pivotal. So we have a diagnosis called the DSM-5, and we have different diagnoses. So there's anorexia nervosa, there's bulimia nervosa, there's binge eating disorder, there's OSFED, so non-specified eating disorders. And then we also have eating disorders that aren't classified yet. So like diabulimia, that's one where patients, I saw a question on there about diabetes, and that's where patients change their insulin to affect how much they're digesting and processing and manipulating their weight and medications. And there's other eating disorders like that. So if you're wanting to get assessed, maybe that's a good question to follow up with is, on ERC's website, we have an assessment there. You can always call ERC to get an assessment, talk to an eating disorder dietitian or therapist, also getting labs, checking electrolytes, any recent changes in weight, getting a DEXA scan, seeing where your bone density is, getting an EKG, measuring where like your heart health is. Those are things to get more information, but definitely talking to a medical provider and one who knows about eating disorders We're in Dallas trying to educate more doctors in the area on noticing and looking for those signs and symptoms.
Yeah.
Some other physical symptoms. Sorry, I'm going to say one more thing. Hair loss. With purging, we often see decay in teeth. So a lot of times dentists or oral hygienists can be the first one. My hairdresser, she's but noticed someone was having patches of hair missing and talked to her client more about it and discovered an eating disorder. So there's also other professions too that see firsthand, if signs and symptoms are occurring.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say, you had mentioned about foods and things like that. I don't know if what the person was asking about specifically, but I know myself, there are certain foods that I considered safe foods that were okay to eat. And part of recovery was learning to eat those pure foods and not stick to limited, quote unquote, safe foods. And I think television, media, social media, everything, and that whole diet culture that Kate referred to can create certain foods as being a certain way. And one of the most important things I learned in recovery is that food is food. It shouldn't be classified as good or bad. It all can be part of what you eat. So
exactly, like incorporating a variety and being flexible and having a well-balanced diet. And I was talking to a patient today about different fear foods and diet cultures. So something as dietitians, we dispel and break down all those messages that diet culture is saying. Diet culture is a $60 billion money maker. A lot of things aren't regulated, but they should be. TikTok, oh my goodness, taking things by a storm. So those are other things that we do. We help with midlife patients as well as all of our other patients too.
Yeah. And we're getting a lot of questions. So to everyone putting our questions in, we are going to incorporate as many of them into the live talk as we can, and we'll have a designated time for Q&A at the end. But anyone asking specific questions about how to get treatment for themselves or specific questions about kind of medical concerns, that's going to be outside the scope of this webinar. But I would really encourage you to get in touch with ERC or call the ANID helpline and let us help you get connected to people who really can answer those specific questions for you. Okay, so to kind of just change tracks a little bit, Betsy, Kate, you both have really strong connections to tennis. So, yeah. And Betsy, tennis plays a really strong theme in your book. I mean, there's a tennis racket on the cover. It's called The Longest Match. I wonder, as you think about your past connections to tennis and sports in general, is there anything in your approach that you might do differently or that really kind of stands out to you now as you look back?
Well, I will just to give a little background. Tennis was a huge part of my adolescence. I was a nationally ranked junior player, and I really appreciated my mom supporting my dream of pursuing tennis seriously. But as a child in the environment I grew up in, tennis really became my primary source of self-esteem. It was what I did that I felt good about myself. And I did well at and got positive attention. My mother got positive attention as the mother of, one of the top local junior players in our area. So as a child, it was an outlet as well, hitting a tennis ball. I grew up in a home where I wasn't allowed to even think anything negative. I mean, I had to be positive all the time. There was no place for negative emotions or feelings or any kind of negative affect. So tennis provided this amazing physical outlet for all these emotions and feelings that I couldn't even have begun to articulate, let alone feel. So as a child, tennis was great. I mean, it gave me this physical outlet. It was a tremendous source of self-esteem. And then other benefits like being able to travel around the country and, new friendships. I went on to play Division I college tennis, and again, great team memories and friendships. Then I didn't play tennis for about 20 years, went to law school, got married, 3 kids, whatever. And when I got back into tennis in my 40s, it became very entangled with my eating disorder, and it contributed to it significantly in that I lost weight I didn't need to lose. I'm a small frame person, and the weight loss was concerning. That's how the doctor I mentioned noticed it, and it contributed to my developing an intense fear of gaining weight. And I worried about gaining weight when I hit menopause. I worried just about gaining weight because I got all these great compliments about my new fit muscular body. And everyone's like, oh, wow, you're such a great tennis player. And then I got into coaching tennis. So tennis was such a huge part of my life once again. And that really combined with other factors like a diagnosis of pretty moderate to severe asthma and feeling out of control, the tennis and fear of gaining weight, that created the perfect storm in my 40s that led to the diagnosis of anorexia. So tennis became sort of my ticket to being able to eat. Unfortunately, it made the eating disorder worse, basing what I ate on how much I played tennis and all that. A huge piece of recovery was learning that the proper place that tennis needed to be in my life, and to separate what I ate from how much I played tennis. And I'm fortunate that now I can still play tennis, but I play way less frequently. I don't revolve my life around tennis. I eat whatever I want, whether I played tennis or didn't play tennis. Just a much healthier balance. But overall, I think participating in any sport has so many benefits, but for any athlete out there, it is critical that the exercise, the sport is fueled properly. And that is something I learned in recovery. If you're going to play X hours of tennis, you need to fuel your body even more than the average person who's not moving their body. So tennis was a huge part of my life, so many benefits from it, but I can honestly say, looking back, I may not have developed a full-blown eating disorder, but for my return to tennis at a pretty high level in my 40s and the subsequent weight loss that I never intended. But when your brain's not being nourished, it just fueled the eating disorder, and I got further and further stuck.
Mm-hmm.
Kate, how can people work to ensure that they're really approaching their sport, whatever it is, in a healthy way?
Mm-hmm. So things that we focus on at ERC is really taking an itinerary of what the sport gives you and provides to you, and your relationship to that exercise and that movement. So we often reframe relationships to sports. We talk about making movement mindful and healthy ways to tweak your approach to activity. We also recommend getting medically cleared by the doctor and your team. If someone's at a higher level of care, like inpatient or residential, we slowly incorporate movement back, but with always having someone be there with them, whether it's hit a tennis ball or kick a soccer ball or go on a walk. We always make sure they're in community and with their support, and talking to them about, were you able to meet meal plan that day? Were you able to eat even more than maybe you needed to, or do you have that flexibility? Are you able to eat a variety of foods, not just your safe playing the sports? Because oftentimes I see athletes saying, I only can eat my safe foods because I want to be the best player. And so working with them on saying, okay, how can we make sure you're incorporating your foods, whether it's desserts or whether it's candy, fried food, whatever it is, because your eating disorder is going to take a hold of that and use that against you. So we really work on building a better relationship with food and movement.
I'll also add, my treatment team wanted very much for me to stop playing tennis temporarily so that I would weight restore more quickly. But because I was medically stable and an adult, I made the decision to continue playing tennis. But one of the most important lessons I learned in recovery is how to take days off, how to rest.
Yes.
And I think no matter what level athlete you are, your body needs rest. And I also learned that my organs needed to be nourished even on days when there was no movement of any kind. So I really had to separate
Mhm.
what I ate, food, nourishment, from how much I exercised, played tennis, moved my body. And it had been, because I was an athlete for so many years, the connection between food and exercise was so strongly ingrained.
Mhm.
So that was a big task in recovery for me, was separating that and knowing that my body needed nourishment every single day, completely disconnected from how much tennis I was playing. So my treatment team set boundaries. If I played tennis, I couldn't also go for a walk. And, if I was playing tennis, then I needed to add this to my meal plans. So they were able to work with me so that I didn't have to give up tennis. And again, I was medically stable and this treatment was outpatient. But we worked to come up with something that worked.
Yeah, I like how you're saying kind of the structure, the consistency and limits around tennis and around sports, and making sure you get the nourishment with food and water as well. We often see patients not drinking enough water, so making sure they get in that for their sport too.
That's amazing. Yeah. And when we're talking about athletes, we're not just talking about professional athletes, right?
Talk about all people. You're right. Like the person that works works out a couple hours a week versus the pro athlete, making sure they're having a good relationship with food. And also what Betsy was saying, like the identity with tennis. Like I grew up as a tennis player and I totally get it. My whole family loves tennis and it can be such an identity. And so forming a new identity outside of that can really help you form new coping skills and patterns. And what we do a lot of times in treatment is seeing if we challenge the identity, because a lot of times the athletes wear athletic clothes to treatment. So even from a fashion perspective, working with them on, hey, can you, if you're in your midlife and you're working a job, can we make sure that you're working in the appropriate work clothes? If you're doing X, Y, or Z, can you wear something besides tennis shoes? So Betsy, I don't know if that happened in your treatment, but I love fashion as well as food. And so I also work with that clothing aspect too. We see that a lot with athletes. They want to only wear workout clothes to treatment.
Right. My exercise clothes were my work clothes. I coached high school tennis, while I was struggling with my eating disorder. So that's what I felt most comfortable wearing. And yeah, definitely.
There's so many aspects of treatment that I think people just don't think about. That's not one that I was on my radar. I wonder. That's probably true for some other folks as well.
Now it's the opposite. I do play tennis, but I still, a few times a week, but I love days when I'm like, oh, I'm not playing tennis. I can wear real clothes today.
Yeah.
All right. So ladies, how can someone entering treatment in midlife advocate for themselves in that treatment with the understanding that they might have different needs than a lot of the patients around them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So from my perspective, advocating for what they need to the treatment team is so important. Not playing the older figure role to the younger patients. I see that a lot. So really I recommend like patients to put on their blinders and like really focus on their treatment, because it can be so easy to be the mom or the dad of the milieu. And this time is for you to be a little selfish and work on yourself, because usually people in midlife are taking care of people younger or older than them, and this is the time for you.
I hear from a lot of people that they leave treatment, people in middle age and beyond, that they leave treatment prematurely because they feel like they're in the mother role or the grandmother role or the father role, whatever it is. And I think what you said, Kate, about putting blinders on and realizing you're there for you and you deserve treatment, you deserve recovery as much as everybody there. Ideally, I would love to see treatment tracks for older adults. Not that older adults can't recover when they're in treatment with younger people, but and like I said, I did not go to a higher level of care, but I would love to see tracks geared towards older adults, because I think then they're more likely to stay in treatment and get the help that they need and deserve and feel comfortable.
And they're going through different things too. And so advocating if they need help or resources in specific ways, making sure they're asking for that help. And like you're saying, Betsy, is just keeping the blinders up and having different treatment tracks tailored to them, because treatment's not cookie cutter. It needs to be individualized, and we really focus on that at ERC.
A mother of 3, I didn't know it was even an option to put myself in my recovery first. So I'm grateful that I was able to recover solely outpatient, but it probably took a lot longer than it would have. But when I was struggling, there's no way I could have prioritized my recovery, because I would have felt too bad about disrupting my family life. So I think that's what's really hard at this stage when you are a caregiver. Very hard to think of putting your own needs first, but it is essential to get the treatment that's needed.
What about the people out there who maybe know that they need help but aren't able to get the diagnoses that they're looking for, that they need to really start recovery? How do they advocate for themselves if they really know that they're struggling, but they're being dismissed by maybe a doctor who does really feel that eating disorders are a young person's thing?
I recommend going to a different doctor.
I will tell that I share this a lot, but my primary care physician is absolutely an outstanding physician. However, she could use some education on eating disorders when I was really struggling, and she was having me check in, more frequently than just my annual physical. I had to go every few months for weight checks and all that. She actually said to me, "Oh, don't worry, when you hit menopause, you'll have no trouble gaining weight." Well, I heard that with the ears of the eating disorder, and the eating disorder is like, "Don't worry, I won't let that happen to you." So my own primary care physician, who was outstanding, said something that was so triggering and fed right into my eating disorder and one of my greatest fears, which was gaining weight. And basically she was saying, "Oh yeah, of course you're going to gain weight when you hit menopause." And, my dietitian completely helped me negate that. And but again, she's an outstanding physician. So you really need somebody. If somebody's out there is really struggling and needs that diagnosis and resources, help, support, you need to reach out to someone who will take you seriously, some sort of medical provider who will take you seriously and connect you with what you need.
And ERC does free assessments, so you can always be assessed and then get diagnosed here. But again, like what Betsy is saying, I agree with the doctor, like help. Some doctors are still learning about eating disorders and may say triggering things. So really getting a couple different views and perspectives on it. And something we're trying to do is definitely educate more doctors on natural growth curves and what to say, not to say at different life stages.
And I will say my primary care physician just recently finished reading my book and actually sent me a message through the portal, the patient portal, telling me that she really enjoyed it. And I was initially hesitant for her to read it because I didn't want her to see, because I wrote in my book about that experience with her comment about menopause. But so hopefully I educated her within my book that she just read. So
I bet you did. That's awesome.
Hopefully.
Way to advocate, Betsy.
Trying.
Yeah. So where can people who might be in midlife now and looking for help, where can they go? Are there resources specific to them?
Yeah, I mean, Eating Recovery Center has several resources. We also have a Dallas local chapters of groups that people can get access to. I think about Facebook groups, organizations like NIDA that have several resources. So I recommend even a quick Google search, like resources in my area, or I know Tatum in the chat box posted resources too, like caregiver support groups, things like that she put.
I would
And I
say
know
the Alliance for Eating Disorders based in Florida, they're an excellent resource as well. And of course, ANID, and I love being a mentor where I get to work on one-on-one peer support, never a substitute for the professional treatment, but a nice add-on when you need that, someone who gets it outside of your professional appointments. So there is help and support out there. There's still obviously too many barriers to care and resources, financial impediments, but there are a lot of resources out there. So I think that Google search and checking the websites of the organizations we've mentioned, and of course, ANID, are certainly ways to find out what's available.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And just so everyone knows, we will be sending out a list with some of these resources that we mentioned following this webinar. So you'll get some of those straight to your inbox as well. So something else that was asked in a couple different ways is for people who struggled for a long time and are mostly recovered.
Mhm.
Do both of you think that full recovery is real, or will there kind of always be the remnants, the few leftover behaviors in the back of their mind?
I think it's a great question. Sure, I'm happy to answer that. I don't like spending a lot of time on the semantics of in recovery, recover, whatever. Yes, full recovery is absolutely possible, but I think we can define it in different ways. For me personally, I would say my recovery is very, very strong. And if I ever hear anything related to my eating disorder, it's a whisper now. And I now have the tools and know how to immediately disobey and do the right thing and focus on recovery. So there are some people who never hear from the eating disorder again and are fully recovered. And there's others who are recovered, but they still may feel sometimes they have to manage it. And my therapist used the analogy of recovery is really about learning how to cope with life. And one thing I learned is, yes, recovery is absolutely amazing. It's worth the hard work. But that doesn't mean that there are no longer going to be stressors and challenges and difficult experiences in life. And I think the key in recovery is learning other ways of coping, because the eating disorder developed for a reason. It developed as a protective, maladaptive way of coping with life. So recovery is about not going back to those eating disorder behaviors as a way to cope, but instead learning healthier ways of coping. So I say, yes, I'm recovered, but I prefer to say my recovery is very strong and I have healthy ways of coping when life gets challenging. But on some level, it is something I will always manage in a certain way. And that is just making sure that I am always nourishing my body sufficiently, maintaining my weight, and living a well-balanced life.
Yeah, I agree. And I like to a meaningful, balanced life and continuing to get that support. I see often that patients end their therapy sessions or dietitian appointments too soon. And so many life events are still going to happen. And having at least like a check-in every once in a while with those people can help with managing recovery and keep being on that track. And that's what I've heard from patients that are 1 or 2 years out of treatment is like, hey, I moved cities, or hey, I got married, or hey, my kids went to college and I still met with my dietitian right before saying, hey, how can I plan for this weekend to visit them in the college town? Or hey, how can I move across the state and meet meal plan? Traveling from Dallas to Chicago, trying to make sure that those things are in check. So
right. People ask me all the time if I still see anyone to manage, an illness that I have recovered from. And my dietitian retired several years ago and I haven't seen her or been in touch, but I continue to see my therapist who specializes in eating disorders. Our conversations are very important to my leading a healthy, recovered life. For me, so much of my eating disorder was years and years of internalizing and suppressing difficult emotions. So I feel like I will always need that safe space to continue to unravel and unpack all those layers of suppressed emotions. So I'm grateful I have that safe space. And I just feel like recovery is a lifelong journey. And there's always going to be, twists and turns along the way. And the more support you have, fortunately now I'm able to receive support from others in my life and connect with others and know when I need to reach out for help and support, which when you're in the throes of an eating disorder, you can't even imagine. But you can get that support and authentic connection with other people as well once you're able to let yourself be vulnerable and ask for what you need. So I'm grateful I do still have that safe space, but it's not only that space, it's also time with others and connecting with life.
I love that. Okay, so everyone, we have about 10 minutes left. So now we're going to pivot into the more formal Q&A part of this webinar. There's a lot of questions already waiting for us. If you have anything else you want to ask, please feel free to drop it in the Q&A. We'll get to as many of these as we have time for. So one that I think we'll start with, because it was asked a couple different ways, is how do you safely talk to someone, approach someone who you're concerned about? If you're seeing them struggling, engaging in behaviors that you're concerned about, how do you approach that conversation in a sensitive way?
Okay.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And we get that a lot from families and loved ones. And a lot of times it's figuring out your relationship with that person and doing it in a very sensitive environment and making sure that you're really thoughtful and loving in your words. It's a scary subject. It's the most vulnerable thing about them that you're bringing up and almost exposing. So come at it in a very humble and caring way is the best way to approach it, and say that you're there to support them and help them get help. For me personally, helping my friends get treatment has been hard. They've been mad. Sometimes it's getting their parents involved or getting their boyfriend or husband involved, specifically from my personal stories. And it's been really challenging, but one of my best friends who's recovered, it was because her friends sat her down and said, "You are going to die if you continue." And so she's now in recovery, and she's so thankful that someone was honest and direct with her, because it saved her life.
And I would say because eating disorders, like any mental illness, have that degree of shame and stigma, it's very hard for someone to talk about it. So that person who's trying to bring it up just needs that extra level of sensitivity and care and compassion.
Mm-hmm.
What about supporting someone who's currently working on recovery and is really sensitive about things like, oh, things aren't moving through me, my stomach doesn't feel good, things along those lines?
I think focusing on who they are as a person and not making comments about looks, but more about who they are as a person is important.
Mm-hmm. And asking them how you can support them. Sometimes the best thing is to ask. Ask them, "Hey, how can I help?" And from a nutrition's perspective, like that dietitians, that's what we're trained to do, is to help you with the stomach aches, to help you with the distress and ways to provide, medications with the doctor's support, of course, to help with the stomach aches. And it's going to feel uncomfortable. Recovery is uncomfortable. But the dietitian is so important because they're the ones that are going to help you physically through that process and mechanically as you start to eat again, or as you start to eat without purging or eat without binge eating, or even ARFID, that's the eating disorder we haven't talked about, avoidant restrictive food intake, help you to swallow foods that you've been scared to swallow. So a lot of the dietitian is so important in the process.
What about on the flip side, for people who are working on recovery, how can they respond to friends and family who are really concerned about weight gain or risk of cardiovascular disease or other health concerns that can be associated with weight gain?
So you can have them join these support groups, but I also recommend that the treatment team helps prepare and coach the patient on how to talk about it, because again, it can be really hard to talk about. So having boundaries in place for when you feel comfortable to share your story, and to also know, how much to share, or with your close friends and family, what would be helpful for your recovery in terms of what to say and not to say. Usually across the board, we recommend not talking about weight or calories or anything, sizes, things like that, that could be really triggering.
And surrounding yourself with people, it doesn't have to be a lot of people, but if someone is particularly triggering or difficult or impeding your recovery, that's not necessarily the person you want to spend a lot of time with.
Yeah.
At this point, you want to surround yourself with people who give you care and support that you need, people who you are willing to let in, sometimes needing you to tell them what you need.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's such a huge piece, communicating with the people around you.
Yeah, definitely. Betsy, how did you develop friendship with people in your life and making sure they modeled healthy eating behaviors? Because I'm sure it's hard right now. Like a lot of people in general in America struggle with having a healthy relationship with food. So how did you build that rapport with others?
Well, unlike many people who struggle with eating disorders who avoid going out to eat in restaurants and that, I always had friends that I liked to go out to lunch with and things like that, but I could find it so triggering, some of their comments about what they were ordering and why they were ordering. It was very difficult. And my eating disorder was always with me and would make sure I never had to be like that. So that's, and then it was sort of an evolution as my recovery got stronger, able to be with the same people and not be triggered, able to order what I want to have. So I love the social aspects about eating meals with other
Yes.
people. And that's what I talk about in groups a lot. I run is recovery is about focusing on who you're with and the conversation and the occasion, instead of so many worries about who's going to be there, what am I going to eat, what am I not going to eat, what food are they going to have, what if they don't have this. And I know what that feels like. It's so hard.
Yeah.
Recovery helps you move forward and being able to eat with others and not be triggered by their comments.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because with treatment interventions as a dietitian, I love that. I'm really social and I try to make treatment fun as possible. It's not a fun process, but I try to get really creative, and I'll do meal passes with patients or grocery store tours or cooking groups to help them form that social aspect of food, because it is a very social thing. And so at ERC, we do like cooking exposures and meal passes where they go to a restaurant with family members and they come back to the unit to process it. So thank you for bringing up that aspect. That's
I will also say my dietitian played a huge role in my learning to eat all foods and not just safe foods. And for me, the biggest fear foods were sweets. The eating disorder didn't allow me to have sweets for a while when I was really struggling. So my dietitian said, what sweets do you miss? And I remember that's one of the reasons a cupcake is on the tennis racket on my book, because a cupcake was one of the first things that I brought to her office, and she cut it in half and we each ate our half of the cupcake together and talked about how it felt. And so she really helped me face those fear foods. And that's why the cupcake is on the racket rather than a tennis ball, because cupcake was one of the first things I learned to eat, and it was in my dietitian's office.
And it's cool to see the dietitian eat those foods, because a lot of people have this perception that dietitians don't eat sugars or sweets or whatever. So it's cool when eating disorder dietitians do that.
She
And
modeled that very well for me. Sometimes I'd bring my lunch and eat it while we talked,
yes.
and I'd have to bring a sandwich if she was eating a sandwich. And so it just normalized things like that.
Yeah.
With practice, I will say.
Yes.
It's always easy.
All right, so I'd love to just answer one or two questions,
Sure.
more questions quickly before we wrap up. So one really that jumped out at me. So has there been research on the differences of the onset and impact of eating disorders amongst women of color, specifically African-American women?
So wait, are they asking the percentage of, I'm gonna look for that question specifically.
I guess what are there differences as we're talking about kind of the onset of eating disorders in midlife? Do you know, are there different numbers for women of color versus white women?
So that's good information for me to find out through research. I don't know the specific percentage. And that's also something in general that eating disorder awareness, we want to incorporate more diversity. I love that ERC, we're hiring a lot more diverse clinicians at all different ethnicities and body sizes, because what I do know about different backgrounds is that a lot of times it is underreported. And so bringing more awareness that it can be in different populations, because a lot of times in textbooks, they say, oh, it's the white skinny female. And that is not the case at all. That is so false. It can happen. I see patients of all different backgrounds and ethnicities. And so something else that I have a heart for is getting financial resources for those people, getting more awareness, because a lot of times it's hard for them to get treatment. But at ERC, we see all types of people, and we really make sure we're focusing right now on inclusivity and making sure people are respected and getting the appropriate care.
Betsy, the next question is for you. So how did you move away from deriving your self-esteem from tennis? This question is from a former athlete who received a lot of praise for physical prowess, and their self-worth is wrapped up in athleticism and aesthetics.
Well, that first was a task when I graduated from college. I played 4 years of D1 college tennis. And so when I went out into the working world, when I was 21, I had always been, Betsy, the tennis player, my whole identity through high school and college. So that was definitely a process, and especially went through a tough time trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And if you've read my book, my father died during that period. It was very, very difficult time for me. But I think it happened gradually as far as getting away from that athletic identity. I worked, I went to law school, got married, had 3 kids. And then when tennis came back into my life in my 40s, and the way it came back was the high school coach at the time was in his 80s, and my daughter was on the team, and I offered to help. Now 14 years later, I just retired from coaching. So tennis became a big part of my identity again in adulthood. But again, it was more as a high school tennis coach. I kept my eating disorder, under wraps with people in my tennis world. It wasn't until my book came out that I heard from some of my tennis friends, me too, I struggled with an eating disorder. I had no idea you did. So I think that identity stays with you, certainly, but it can change and evolve just through different chapters of your life. And again, even if you still have that athlete mentality, again, the bottom line is making sure you nourish yourself appropriately.
Wow.
And I love how your book just gives hope, and I've recommended it already to several patients of mine.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So for everyone who stayed over to hear a little bit more question and answering, thank you for sticking with us. And I just want to remind everyone that help is out there. We will be sending out the recording of this webinar, including some of the resources that we touched on today and some that we didn't. You can always call ERC for a completely free assessment, and you can always reach out to ANID as well. We have free peer support groups every day, every weekday. They all meet for an hour. We have one specific to older adults, and even if you don't reach out to one of us, reach out to someone, because connection really, really matters. Okay.
Kristen, thank you so much. Same with
Yes,
you.
thank you,
Yeah.
Kristen and Kate, for making this happen.
Yeah, it's been a genuine pleasure working with you guys, and thank you for all the work you do, both of you.
And thank you for the work that you do. So important.
Okay, well then everyone, I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.